The road to the plantation narrowed as it disappeared beneath the weight of pines and the long, gray-green sweep of summer-tired moss, and the overseer, James Heron, though few would dare to speak his name aloud in the coming weeks, rode the last mile alone. He had dismissed the wagon driver half a mile back, preferring solitude for his approach, as though the final stretch of dirt and crushed shells might prepare him for the life he intended to build here. His posture stayed rigid, almost ceremonial, and he allowed himself only the smallest glance at the horizon, where the fields lay in unmoving rows, unbroken except for the slow bend of the creek and the distant silhouettes of workers gathering what late cotton the season had spared. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of damp brush, old timber, and something else, something faint, unfamiliar, carried on the wind in thin, evasive threads. It was the scent of the house he was riding toward, though he did not yet know it. He had rehearsed a dozen versions of this arrival on the journey south, nodding confidently at the manager, shaking off the dust of his previous post, ordering a swift inventory of tools, quarters, and ledgers. In his imagination, he had conjured scenes of competent authority, of a man putting his past behind him by burying it under new responsibilities. Yet as the grand house finally came into view, 3 stories of pale, weathered wood with columns whose paint had surrendered to years of storms, he felt a tightening in his chest, a tremor in his breath. It was not fear, or so he told himself. It was simply the weight of beginning again. A man who had something to hide, he believed, could still become someone new if he chose carefully where to place his next step. The plantation itself seemed unwilling to greet him. No riders approached. No voices carried across the yard. The enslaved workers he passed kept their eyes fixed downward, hands steady in their labor, bodies angled slightly away. Even the livestock moved quietly, as if under instruction. Only the crows, perched on the roof of the cotton gin, observed him openly, their glossy feathers lifting in the faint breeze like a warning he did not want to decipher. At the front of the house waited the manager, Mr. Broderick, an elderly man whose skin had grown the color and texture of curled parchment. He leaned heavily on a carved cane, his breath noticeably uneven even as he attempted to stand straighter when Heron approached. The manager's eyes, small and pale, skimmed the overseer's face not with curiosity, but with an unspoken assessment, as though he had already been told more than enough about this newcomer. "You're timely," Broderick rasped, extending a hand that trembled with either age or caution. "The master won't be returning this season. His business in Natchez requires more time than expected. That leaves the running of things squarely with you and me. Mostly with you." Heron dismounted, forcing a polite nod. "I intend to keep order. Efficiency. Discipline." Broderick's gaze sharpened briefly. "So they said about the last one." There was a silence, thin, brittle, almost clinical in its discomfort. Heron felt a prickle rise along the back of his neck, but he managed a neutral expression. Whatever had happened to the previous overseer was not his concern, he reminded himself. History here was thick, yes, but it was not his. He was here to replace, not inherit. Inside, the house carried a layered stillness that seemed to grow from the floorboards themselves. Dust softened the light that struggled through the tall, narrow windows, and the air smelled faintly of old rope, stored cotton, and a distant, dry sweetness that Heron could not immediately place. Broderick moved slowly, leaning into each step as though the corridors themselves resisted him. He led Heron through the main hall, pointing out the rooms with clipped formality, parlor, office, supply storage, guest room, until at last they reached the base of the staircase spiraling upward. "The attic's locked," Broderick said abruptly, tapping his cane against the lowest step. "Been locked long before I took the post. Master says it's better left that way, and I've had no cause to disagree. You may use the rooms on the second floor." Keep to them. Heron hesitated, his eyes drawn upward where the shadows thickened along the curve of the staircase. What is kept in the attic? Broderick's expression did not change. Nothing you need concern yourself with. The answer arrived too quickly, too smoothly, and Heron recognized the type of lie it contained. Not a defensive lie, a practiced one. Still, he offered no argument. He merely nodded and followed the manager back toward the front entrance where the administrative ledger waited. The first meeting with the workers took place before sundown, under the broad shade of the sycamore where all morning announcements were traditionally made. Broderick introduced him with a gesture that was more symbolic than warm, and Heron scanned the gathered faces with the expression he had cultivated over the years, stern, but not cruel, watchful, but not eager to punish. Yet he saw something in their eyes he had not anticipated, not only fear, but caution layered with an unsettling, quiet resignation, as if they had already braced themselves for whatever he might bring. He spoke briefly, outlining expectations, schedules, and rules. His voice stayed level, practiced. He reminded himself to stand tall, to keep his hands clasped behind his back, to present himself as a man wholly unburdened by the past. And for a moment, only a moment, he believed he might succeed. But then a breeze shifted, carrying with it a faint, sour note, something dry and metallic, something unmistakably familiar to him, though no one else reacted. The smell came from the direction of the house. His breath faltered, nearly imperceptible. Later, after supper, alone in the dimly lit dining room, pushing stale bread across a wooden plate, Heron heard the first faint sound from above. A soft, deliberate scuff of movement. A single step, then another, as though someone had placed weight carefully, cautiously, just beneath the rafters. He froze, listening. The air held still. The sound did not return. The next morning began with routines that felt simultaneously new and old. Heron walked the rows of cotton alongside the field hands, observing the condition of the plants, the tools, the fences. He noted the workers' precision, the way they timed their movements with unspoken communication. Their silence was not the simple silence of obedience. It was the silence of people who knew the land intimately and who had learned, over long years, how to carry fear quietly. Broderick joined him near midday, though his pace lagged behind Heron's. "You'll find them efficient," he muttered. "But do not mistake quiet for weakness." "I don't," Heron replied. "You might," Broderick said, and for a heartbeat Heron sensed he was being warned, not about the workers, but about himself. That evening, while inspecting the house, Heron passed the narrow hallway that led to the attic staircase. Something cold gathered low in his stomach when he saw the small door at the end of the corridor, its brass lock tarnished but firm. The dusty smell he had noticed the day before seeped faintly through the edges of the wood, settling in the air like a dormant echo. He approached without thinking, drawn as though by instinct. The closer he drew, the more sharply he felt the old ache of memory, faces he did not wish to see, decisions he wished he had not made, the weight of something he had carried long before arriving here. He reached for the handle. A floorboard creaked behind him. He turned sharply. A young worker, perhaps no more than 14, stood at the other end of the hallway, holding a bucket and staring wide-eyed at the overseer's hand on the attic door. Heron reacted too quickly, too fiercely. "Get away from here," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "You have no business on this floor. Do your work elsewhere." The boy flinched visibly, stepping back so fast the water in the bucket sloshed onto the floor. He muttered an apology, lowered his gaze, and retreated. Only after the child disappeared did Heron realize his own hands were trembling. That night, he found the first clue, a scrap of cloth caught beneath one of the attic door's lower edges. The fabric was stiff, red-brown in places, and frayed along one side as though torn violently. He did not touch it at first. He simply stared, the air around him thickening. He forced himself to kneel and pick it up. His fingers tingled as he lifted it to the lantern light. The stain had aged, darkened, soaked deep into the fibers long ago. But he recognized it. He recognized what it meant. And the smell, dry, metallic, unmistakable, rose from the cloth like a whisper he had hoped never to hear again. Behind him, the attic beams creaked softly, almost like a footstep. He stiffened, breath caught in his throat. The air pressed down on him, heavy, nearly suffocating, as if the house itself remembered something he had tried so desperately to forget. He backed away, folded the cloth into his pocket, and extinguished the lantern. For the remainder of the night, sleep would not come. Every sound, the settling of wood, the murmur of wind, the distant noise of livestock, carried the same rhythm, the same cadence, as the faint footsteps he had heard above. By dawn, he understood what he had already suspected since stepping foot on the property. The attic did not merely hold a secret. It held a secret, and the isolation of this place, far from burying it, only amplified its presence. The plantation was too quiet, the walls too thin, and the past, however carefully locked away, had begun to breathe again. The plantation settled into its late summer rhythm as if nothing at all had shifted, and yet beneath that measured surface a dozen small disturbances gathered like storm clouds, each one feeding the other until the sky above the estate felt permanently overcast. Caleb Turner moved among cotton rows and tool sheds with the outward composure he had cultivated over years of assuming authority. But his steadiness had become a thing of brittle glass. He kept his shoulders squared and his voice even as he issued orders, yet his eyes betrayed him. They darted too often to the house, fixed on the second-story windows until they seemed to burn a private map into the skin behind his ribs. The workers watched that look with a filial caution. They had learned long ago the difference between a man who watched to protect and a man who watched because he feared something would look back. Their hands remained on hoes and sacks, but their conversation thinned into spaces, a tilt of the head, a lowering of the gaze, the almost imperceptible exchange of glances that carried meaning without words. The quarters murmured like a hive, the fields hummed with the business of harvest, and above both, in the house that had received the new overseer, the attic began to speak. At first the sounds were small enough to be dismissed by day. In the heart of the night, when the lamps had guttered low and the wind lay flat over the creek, some slight shifting would come from the roof. A dry scrape, the giving of a floorboard, the tiny, ritual creak of old trunks settling into their own weight. But the noises grew bolder with each passing week, an uneven scuffing, the soft and irregular thudding as if something heavy had been dragged across the boarding, the faint metallic clink that rattled like a sentence half-spoken. The house replied to these noises with its own language, the muffled echo of rafters, the sympathetic tremor that ran down the stair rails, a whispering in the paneling that felt not wholly natural. With each sound the overseer sat bolt upright in bed, lantern sweeping the dark, pulse in his jaw like the knotted end of a rope. He told himself that the house had always made such sounds. Old timber settles, my skitter, wind finds gaps. But the justifications came less readily as the nights lengthened and his claims to reason thinned. The smell came next, patient and precise. It did not announce itself in a single assault, but in soft, invasive breaths. The metallic tang of old blood turned faintly sweet by time, the resinous edge of rot, a closeness like damp cloth that had been folded and forgotten for seasons. It clung to the rafters and stood at the edges of lamplight, sinking into the grain of the floorboards until even the act of breathing seemed to carry residue. Caleb fought it with every household remedy he could name. Turpentine to strip at the scent, coarse fires that would lift it in smoke, linen saturated with vinegar. Each attempt did little but make the odor restless. It circled, and found a new seam to claim, as if it grew by being denied. In the mornings, his coat smelled of it. It rode the dust motes in the sun. Once, during an inventory, his hand brushed a handle, and the fingers came away with the faint iron stain of the smell, and he felt the past press its palm to the hollow of his throat. Such small invasions, the creak, the scent, the appearing and reappearing of things in places they ought not to be, began slowly to unfix the overseer's authority. Caleb made mistakes he would have once considered impossible. He misplaced the plantation ledger, the volume that held debts and credits and the names that mattered in this household, only to find it the next morning at the foot of the attic stairs, its pages cupped and damp as if someone had wept across them. A revolver that habitually rested beneath his pillow was discovered on a servant's shelf in the pantry. A letter he had composed to the absentee owner, formal, restrained, the sort of dispatch men used to build reputations, slid from his coat and vanished for a day before reappearing in the kitchen drawer half-baked with soot. In small, mortal ways he misstepped. He spoke too sharply to a woman mending a shirt and then sat hours later in silence as the guilt gnawed. He allowed a field hand to take a day's rest and later punished the same man for the merest lag. These were not errors born of incompetence so much as the fraying of a mind that resisted its own memories. Everything he controlled in public became uncertain at home, where the attic's presence unspooled. The workers responded to these shifts in subtle, careful manner. They did not confront him. Confrontation was an expensive thing on a plantation where risk never bowed to righteousness. Instead, they adjusted their paths, shifted their rhythms, offered different small intimacies of avoidance. A man sweeping the hall would pause longer at the foot of the stairs and only with a practiced casualness glance up. A girl hauling water would set her pail down a step away from the door, palms white and slow. Some of them experimented in ways that were less easily read. A twig left on top of the attic steps one dawn, as if placed there by whim or child's curiosity, or a scrap of charcoal laying in the cornice so that midnight visitors might find a black mark and imagine that someone else had stood and watched. Not all these acts were overt defiance. Many were little tests, a probing of the opacity of his fear. Such probing was dangerous, but danger here was an old currency, traded for information and for a sliver of agency. Rumors passed through the quarters like a current. There is noise. There is a scent. The overseer does not sleep. No one wanted to speak of what might be there, for tongue named things with authority. Instead, they spoke around the attic like a thorny bush, careful to touch its edges rather than its heart. Among these watchers was Ruthie, small, lithe, with the silent, patient attentiveness of someone who had learned to notice for survival. She moved through the plantation like a shadow that would not be named, delivering wood, tying bundles, always listening as much as doing. On a night when the sky lay flat and the moon was a coin sunk behind cloud, she saw the overseer slip out of his room, lantern in hand, a wrapped bundle cradled like contraband at his arm. He went with a kind of nervous deliberation, one foot placed with care on each stair, the lantern light jittering like a small, anxious heart. Ruthie followed because she could not follow. Curiosity in her was the thin flame of someone who had been taught to record what others pretended not to see. She kept distant as he climbed the steps, chest taut, shoulder pressed to the shadow of the doorframe. The light disappeared behind the attic door, and for a time the house resumed its careful breath. Then, faint as a snuffed candle, a change occurred, a move from the attic that was not part of the house's usual settling. Boards answered to boards in a way that seemed purposeful, as though someone arranged the inside to reply. She stood there, hands clenched, hearing a noise like cloth pulled from an old oak chest, hearing moisture come into the timbre of the sound. When Caleb descended, the lantern's flame low, his coat had a slight dusting about the hems, and something on his hand that did not belong there. A brown smudge, the color of dried clay or older stains. By morning the house bore the marks of his efforts to keep the secret at bay. Iron brackets shorn from tools were hammered across the attic door in the hush of night. A heavy beam lay notched in so it could be forced against the frame should anyone attempt entry. The measures read like an apology in wood, an admission that whatever lay above required more than ordinary locks. Yet these measures were a kind of confession as well. To barricade is to concede that the thing barricaded threatens the barricader. The workers took note. They spoke of the reinforcement in the same breathless way one speaks of thunder, an omen, perhaps, or the last of the old protections finally failing. No one asked for explanation. The silence that followed the brackets screamed its own questions. Caleb worked too, but his labor was now twofold: the outward management of crop and crew, and the inward, frantic administration of an ever-mutating concealment. He scrubbed boards with the bird's bones of a brush until his knuckles cracked. He carried out trunks and set them in the sun to bleach. He burned linen until the smoke choked his own lungs. He went up and down the stairs with buckets and wringing cloths and returned each time with shoulders heavier. The smell only answered him with persistence. A particularly desperate afternoon found him on his knees beneath the eaves, scrubbing a knot until the skin of his hands bled, as if the act could scrape the past from the grain. The next day he discovered smears on his sleeves, like handprints left by someone who had reached through the boards. When he chased these traces to their ends, he was led only to old furniture and dust and the faint thing of memory that smells like iron and sleep. A fissure opened beyond his control when some attempt to erase evidence became itself evidence. He had tried to disguise a stain on a beam, an old mark that had seeped through the boarding, by planing and resealing the wood, by burning a thin layer away and replacing it. The scent flared angry when he did this, as if provoked, and he worked faster and cruder than reason would allow. In haste a shard of wood flew, embedding in the floor near the attic stairs. A worker found it the next morning, a splinter of planed pine with a fresh saw cut and a brown tack of dried matter at its tip. That discovery ricocheted. Rumors that had been a whisper hardened into a chorus. What had been covered was being uncovered. What had been buried was bleeding back into light. Men and women who once mouthed the rehearsed words of obedience began to murmur questions to one another in low, urgent tones. The strain of the plantation's hierarchy, owner absent, manager infirm, overseers straining to hold the center, began to show not as a crack, but as a widening seam. Caleb's moral calculations shifted in ways he would later try to map to necessity. At the time, they were more animal than arithmetic. Impulses that rose unchecked when a man spoilt with fear decides between keeping a lie and protecting himself. He tried to arrange accounts and alibis, to reconstruct his nights into harmless, plausible activities, but the ledger of conscience was not so easily falsified. He spent hours drafting a note, half apology, half explanation, to the plantation's owner, imagining how one might translate shame into credibility. He never sent it. His pen stalled when the words turned to admitting that he had brought with him an old and terrible thing. Each effort to explain hardened the lie it sought to remedy. He found himself thinking of the children at the quarters, of Ruthie's careful steps, of a small boy who had once almost drowned in the creek and had been saved by another child's hand, and the cost of exposure shifted from abstract hazard to a ledger of lives. Hiding the truth, he recognized in a moment of terrible clarity, was no longer solely about his reputation or freedom. It had become a slow, creeping cruelty that would demand more and more abrasion of humanity in return for silence. By the close of the third week, the plantation existed in a new temporality, the public clockwork of harvest and duty overlaid by a private tempo of fear. Daylight continued to run its honest errands. Sickles clipped cotton, mules strained, the overseer barked orders, but a shadow trailed every step. The attic's mutterings threaded through meals and prayer, through the passing of buckets and the stitching of shirts. The iron-bracketed door stood like a martyred prophecy, and in the ledger of the household, something unaccounted for grew heavy enough to tip the balance. There came a night when the workers spoke louder about leaving, not as a threat, but as a wish, and the manager Broderick, with his parchment skin and slow breath, asked two soft, careful questions that seemed to tremble with the authority of a man finally remembering himself. What will you do if the secret becomes known? Who will stand when the truth is burned open? Caleb had no answer he would claim aloud. He could only feel the attic above his head as a pressure that might, at any moment, find its seams and free the thing it held. He paced that night from room to room, lantern guttering, stopping when the sound, a new, ragged noise, cut across the floor like someone clearing a long-locked throat. The house listened, the workers listened. So did he. Hiding the truth had become for him not an act of preservation, but an act of violence that multiplied with each concealment. Every reinforcement, every sweep of boards, every burning of cloth was a small addition to a structure that would not hold. The cost of silence began to be counted in the small defeats that accumulate before collapse. Missed sleep, mislaid kindness, the quiet erosion of the small confidences that make a man humane. Caleb found himself watching not merely to guard a secret, but to count the loss of the things that mattered. Trust, the face of a child who looked up without calculation, the faint, human hope that a man might someday atone instead of hiding. The attic's noises continued, patient as moss growing over stone, and the plantation, with its rows of cotton and its long shadows, waited like a breath held too long. The weeks that followed pressed themselves into the plantation like an unwelcome season, heavy and unmoving. What had once seemed an isolated disturbance, sounds in the night, the stubborn smell of something spoiled in the beams, now bled into every corner of the estate with a persistence that mocked all Caleb Turner's attempts to contain it. The fear that had begun as a private tremor in his chest now threaded itself through the routines of the workers, through the already fraught structure of the household, and through the fragile tension that kept this remote Mississippi plantation from collapsing under its own contradictions. The attic had grown restless, as though it sensed that the overseer's resolve was nearing its end. Caleb's face changed first. His eyes, once sharp and watchful with the cold calculation required of his position, turned hollow around the edges, as though something inside him had withdrawn just beyond reach. He spoke less, barked less, but when he did speak his words had a clipped, brittle edge. His body moved with the stiff precision of someone who had rehearsed every gesture. Even the act of picking up a ledger or closing a gate took on a strangely deliberate quality, like he feared that a sudden movement might loosen something better left untouched. He had begun to take decisive actions, though none of them carried the clarity or courage he tried to project. His first attempt, quietly conceived, desperately implemented, was relocation. He spent one humid evening dragging an old steamer trunk from the attic, sweating through his shirt as he maneuvered it down the narrow stairs. The trunk was heavy, though the contents shifted with a softness that suggested not objects but a shape, something that had resisted decay with a determination unnatural in the heat of Mississippi. He dragged it across the floorboards of the upper hall, pausing often to listen, breath shallow, until he reached the back of the house. There he attempted to wedge the trunk into a storage alcove beneath the eaves. The confined space smelled of dust and old rope. For a moment he allowed himself to believe this rearrangement might weaken the attic's influence, that distance could muffle memory. But as he forced the trunk into the dark, something inside shifted violently, once, then again, like a knee striking wood. Caleb recoiled as if burned. He shoved the trunk fully into the alcove, jammed it between beams, and fled down the stairs, hands shaking. By dawn, the trunk was back in the attic. No one saw him return it. No one needed to. The workers sensed the failure in the energy of the house itself. That morning, a woman sweeping the hall crossed herself under her breath. A field hand refused to enter the overseer's residence to fetch a tool. Even the plantation dogs avoided the eastern side of the building, whining at the base of the porch steps and refusing to come when Caleb called. Broderick, the aging manager whose authority had grown half imaginary with time, began to watch the overseer with a kind of half-remembered vigilance. His eyes, clouded and sunken though they were, still caught the nuances of a crumbling hierarchy. He saw the tremor in Caleb's hands when he poured water. He saw how the young man paused at thresholds, as though listening for a summons. Broderick, once firm in his quiet submission to the routines of the plantation, now sensed an order unraveling, thread by thread. He questioned Caleb about missing records, about why certain tools had been moved, about why the iron brackets had been pried and bent, as though someone had tried to tamper with the attic door from either side. Caleb brushed him off with polite irritability, but Broderick's suspicion had rooted itself. The workers grew bolder, though not uniformly. Some remained fearful, unwilling to act except in whispers exchanged at dusk. Others grew restless with anger. Anger at the overseer's erratic cruelty, at the sense that something unseen was making decisions that should belong to the living. One faction emerged, small but determined, quiet investigators, men and women who had decided that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, offered more power than the ignorance Caleb relied upon. Among these was Ruthie. Ruthie had always watched the overseer with a peculiar calm, neither deferential nor openly defiant. She carried a natural stillness that let her slip through the plantation's routines without drawing attention, and in that stillness she listened more deeply than others could. She heard the new patterns of noise in the attic, the thudding that no longer waited for nightfall, the scraping that dragged across boards with the slow insistence of someone testing boundaries. She noticed that the pigeons nesting beneath the eaves had abandoned their roosts. Feathers lay scattered like a muted warning on the ground below. The nighttime disturbances escalated, growing from whispers to declarations. Twice, workers reported hearing something slam against the attic door so hard the walls trembled. Caleb denied it fiercely. He told them the wind had picked up, or that raccoons sometimes climbed inside the roof. But each time he spoke, his voice trembled with the cadence of a man lying to himself first. Then came the letters. Scraps of old paper, brittle and browned with age, began appearing in strange places, crumpled beneath the staircase, wedged in the corner of a windowsill, slipped beneath the threshold of the overseer's bedroom door. Some bore handwriting so faint it resembled scratches more than words. Others bore stains, some dark, some yellowed. One morning, a worker found a letter pinned to the outside of the attic door with a rusted nail. She ran from the house trembling. Caleb tore it down before anyone else could read it. But he read it, and whatever he saw there hollowed him more completely than any noise or smell had managed. He tried a second act of desperation, destruction. He carried tools to the attic, axes, saws, coils of rope, even a lantern burning hotter than wisdom would advise. The workers saw him climb the stairs, saw the light flicker through cracks in the boards, heard the thud of wood against wood. A minute later the sound stopped abruptly. Something shifted above, something heavy, deliberate, and Caleb stumbled backward down the stairs, lantern shaking in his hand, face drained to the color of tallow. The workers watching from the kitchen doorway saw that he had blood on his knuckles, though none could tell whether it was his own. After that night, Caleb began losing sleep entirely. The days blurred into a haze of suspicion. Every gesture from a field hand seemed an accusation. He believed the workers were conniving against him, that the manager was plotting to place him under scrutiny, that the very creak of the house carried malice. His paranoia fed on itself. He shouted without reason. He gave contradictory instructions. He began carrying his revolver openly, loading it with trembling hands as though expecting attack from every shadow. But the shadows were not his enemies. The truth he had locked away was. The turning point came on a day thick with humidity, when even the breath of the trees seemed reluctant. Caleb had left the attic door unlatched in his haste, an oversight so small he would later fail to recall making it. That morning, while sweeping the hall, Ruthie noticed the crack in the door. It was barely visible, but she had been waiting for such a moment. She placed her broom aside and stepped quietly toward the stairs, heart pounding so fiercely she feared it might give her away. Each step felt stolen from fate itself. She reached the landing, paused, then pressed her hand to the door. It gave. Only inches, but enough. The smell rushed out in a wave so strong it nearly doubled her over. A sickly mix of decay and old wounds, and something else, something metallic, like breath drawn through old coins. Her eyes watered, but she forced herself to look inside. At first, all she saw was darkness and the faint shape of the steamer trunk, half open, its lid warped. But then her eyes adjusted. She saw the outline of something slumped against the far wall, wrapped in cloth stained brown and rust red. The figure, too, contorted to sleep, too still to be living. And beside it, on the floor, lay a small dress, child-sized, torn at the back. She gasped involuntarily. The figure inside the attic moved. Not fully, not enough to suggest a living being, but enough that the cloth shifted, enough that a hand, a small hand, impossibly small, slid into view beneath the folds. Ruthie stumbled back, knocking a box from the landing. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot. Caleb came running. He saw the open door. He saw Ruthie frozen in horror. And in that instant, all the lies he had told himself cracked like thin ice under a boot. He slammed the attic door shut with a violence that rattled the frame and dragged Ruthie away, gripping her shoulders so tightly she cried out. His face bore a wild, terrified desperation, not the anger of an overseer reprimanding a worker, but the panic of a man whose last defense had just shattered. "What did you see?" he demanded, voice shaking. Ruthie said nothing. Her silence was not defiance. It was shock. Caleb shook her. Tell me. Tell me." But her silence widened into something dangerous. Someone heard the shouting. Then another. Within minutes, the hallway filled with bodies. Men and women drawn by fear, curiosity, and the unmistakable sense that the overseer was losing the last of his control. Broderick arrived last. He saw Caleb gripping Ruthie. He saw the workers gathered in a tense semicircle. He saw the attic door trembling slightly in its frame, as though something inside leaned against it. And he understood, with the slow, dreadful certainty of an old man recognizing a pattern he had thought long forgotten, that whatever secret Caleb had brought into this house was no longer hidden. "What have you done?" Broderick whispered. Caleb said nothing. Someone among the workers, no one would later agree on who, stepped forward and said, "The attic. Open the attic." The room went still. Caleb raised his revolver. No. The workers froze. Broderick stepped back. Ruthie closed her eyes. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire plantation seemed to hold its breath. Then, from inside the attic, something scraped slowly across the floor, long, deliberate, like nails dragging along wood. Caleb's grip tightened on the gun. His breath came ragged. The door shuddered. And the chain of consequences, set in motion long before this moment, could no longer be stopped. The storm arrived before dawn, dragging a bruise-colored sky over the plantation and pressing the air into something thick enough to choke on. The clouds hung low, scraping the tops of the pines. Every creature in the fields seemed to sense it. The mules refused to leave their sheds. Birds circled without settling, and even the wind felt hesitant. The workers gathered outside the quarters in an uneasy half-circle, whispering with the kind of urgency that could no longer be contained. They were waiting, though none of them could have said for what. The house itself looked altered by the night's events. Shutters askew, lanterns still lit in the upstairs hall, and the attic window cracked open, as if something inside had tried to breathe. The overseer had not come out. The news of what had been discovered in the attic traveled through the quarters like a fever, quiet at first, carried in broken sentences, then swelling into something undeniable. The one who had entered the attic, an older man known for his calm and caution, had lost all composure when he stumbled out of the house in the dark. His voice had cracked, his hands shaking violently as he tried to explain what he'd seen. And though his words tumbled over themselves and made little sense, they all carried the same weight. Whatever was hidden in that attic was not merely a secret. It was a crime, a horror, a thing that had rotted so long in silence it had grown teeth. By the time the manager, a frail, half-blind man whose authority had disintegrated months before, made his way toward the house with his cane tapping on the packed dirt, the workers had already decided they would not return to the fields. Not that day. Not until the truth was dragged into the open daylight. Inside the house, the overseer had barricaded himself in the upstairs hallway. A chair wedged beneath the door handle. A lantern burning so hot it made the metal hiss when touched. His clothes still carried dust from the attic floor. His hands were bloodied from splinters and from something else he refused to look at. He had spent most of the night pacing between the attic door and the staircase, muttering half-sentences to himself, trying to assemble a plan that no longer existed. Every time the house creaked, he flinched. Every time the lantern flickered, he tightened his grip on the key in his pocket. The secret was no longer his. The hinges had given way in the night when the witness had forced the door. The boards he'd nailed and re-nailed for months had buckled. What he had kept hidden, fed, soothed, and threatened into silence was no longer contained. The narrow space beneath the roofline had spilled its truth into the open, truth in the form of bones, stained cloth, and something that had once been human but had long since crossed into something else. Something he had tried to preserve, something he had tried to deny, something he had sworn was not his fault. He had told himself these lies until they felt almost true. Now the lies were ashes, and the storm outside was growing. By midday, the manager reached the steps of the main house. Rain had begun its first hesitant drops, tapping against the porch roof like warning knocks. His face looked carved from chalk, but there was a rage in him that had not been seen in years, a rage born from betrayal more than shock. "You up there," he called, voice trembling with age and fury. "You open this door and explain what in God's name you've done." The overseer didn't answer. His breath came in harsh, uneven pulls, sweat blurring his vision. He pressed his back against the wall, the key digging into his palm. The lantern beside him threw a sickly light over the hallway, illuminating the claw marks near the attic door, marks he had ignored until now. Downstairs, footsteps gathered. Workers, dozens of them. They filled the entryway, the staircase, the hallway below. They did not shout or threaten. Their silence was harder than any demand. Heavy, cold, certain. The overseer felt it from where he crouched in the hallway. Their presence climbed the walls like smoke. For the first time since arriving at the plantation, he realized that he was outnumbered in every direction, by the living and by the dead. When the manager climbed the stairs, leaning heavily on the railing, the overseer moved to block him, pressing the chair more firmly under the handle. "You don't want to see it," he said, voice cracking. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "What wasn't?" the manager rasped. "Answer me." The overseer swallowed, throat burning. The truth pressed against his lips like steam against a boiler, threatening to burst. He had killed a man. Not quickly, not cleanly. not even out of necessity, though he had long told himself it had been self-defense. It had been rage, rage sparked by defiance, by a look he refused to accept, by the reminder of a past he'd tried to outrun. And after it was done, after the panic had set in, he dragged the body into the attic and convinced himself it was only temporary. He would bury it, burn it, move it, anything. But the storm had come sooner than he'd expected. And decomposition, slow, relentless, impossible to negotiate with, had taken its course. Then came the sounds. At first, animals. Then something else, something he told himself was his imagination because the alternative was unbearable. And now it was exposed. All of it. You should leave, the overseer whispered. All of you. Let me handle it. Handle what? The manager snapped. The corpse you tried to hide? The stench you hoped we'd ignore? The fear you beat into every soul here. Below them, someone gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer. The overseer stepped back, clutching the wall. His heart pounded so violently he feared it would split open. You think I wanted this, he shouted, his voice echoing down the staircase. You think I meant for any of this to happen? I was trying to fix things, trying to make it right. The manager raised a trembling hand toward the attic door. Open it, he ordered. They all deserve to see. Lightning cracked across the sky, shaking the house. No, the overseer said, voice rising with panic. If you open it again, if you disturb it, something else will happen. You don't understand what's up there now. It's angry. It remembers. A murmur rippled through the gathered witnesses. Fear, disbelief, suspicion, every emotion but trust. The manager took another step. Open that door. The overseer snapped. He lunged forward, shoving the manager back with a force that sent him stumbling into the arms of the workers below. A cry burst from the crowd. In that instant, everything broke. Whatever fragile structure remained of the plantation's hierarchy fractured like old plaster. Hands reached for the overseer from the stairs. Shouts rose, some demanding justice, some screaming for restraint, others calling warnings. The overseer fled. He ran toward the attic, toward the one place he thought he might control what happened next. The lantern swung wildly in his hand, scattering fractured shadows across the walls. He slammed the attic door behind him, dragging whatever debris he could find in front of it. Old trunks, loose boards, a cracked rocking chair. The smell hit him first, thick, sweet, suffocating. Then the darkness, broken only by the lantern's trembling flame. The attic was no longer silent. Something shifted in the far corner, beneath the rafters. I'm sorry, he whispered into the dark. I tried. You know I tried. Footsteps pounded up the stairs outside. Shouts. The manager's voice. The workers' voices. The house felt alive with movement. The overseer raised the lantern higher, and the light fell on the thing he had tried so long to hide. What remained of the man he had killed, and what that man had become in the long, airless months alone in the attic. The bones were sunken into the floorboards. The twisted limb the overseer had broken in their struggle lay at an impossible angle. The eyes, those he had refused to meet even in death, seemed to regard him now with a hollow, accusing stare. Thunder boomed. The overseer collapsed to his knees. I didn't mean to, he whispered. I swear it. I didn't mean to. The door behind him shuddered. Someone was forcing it open. He looked back at the corpse, at the remnants of a life he had taken and buried in darkness, at the truth he had chained and denied and fed with lies. And he understood, finally and fully, the answer to the question he had been running from since the day he'd arrived. How far can a man go to hide the truth before it destroys him? The door splintered. A dozen hands reached through. The lantern slipped from his grasp. The flame caught the dry floorboards instantly. A scream rose, whether from the overseer, the crowd outside, or the storm itself, no one could later say. The fire spread. The door burst open. The truth, at last, was undeniable. and the plantation's final hierarchy collapsed into chaos. Every man, woman, and child forced to choose between escape, confrontation, or the flames climbing hungrily toward the roof. The smoke clung to the plantation for 3 full days before the wind finally shifted and carried it toward the lowlands. Even then, the smell lingered in the walls, in the fields, in the fabric of old work shirts left drying on the quarter's railings. Some said the fire had purified the place, burned away the rot that had seeped into its bones. Others said it had only uncovered what was always there, the truth rising like the soot that blackened the sky that night. But nearly everyone agreed that from the moment the attic burst into flames, something fundamental had ended. Not just the overseer's grip or the fragile order the manager had pretended to maintain, but the illusion that the plantation's darkness could remain sealed behind wood and silence. The fire had not consumed the entire main house, but it had crippled it. The roof over the attic had collapsed inward, burying what remained of the corpse in charred beams and hot ash. When the workers and the manager finally forced their way in after the flames receded, they found the overseer alive, though barely. He had been pulled half-conscious from the wreck, hair singed, clothes scorched. Some said he tried to crawl back into the flames, but the smoke was too thick, and hands too strong dragged him out before he could disappear into them. Others insisted they saw him strike out at those rescuing him, mumbling a childlike refusal to be saved. No one knew which version was true. No one wanted to ask. The overseer survived 2 more days. They kept him in the old parlor, the only room untouched by fire, where the wallpaper peeled in thin curls and the furniture smelled of mildew. He lay on a cot, delirious, drifting in and out of some fevered world in which the attic still existed and the dead man still whispered from the shadows. He spoke to the corners of the room, to the ceiling beams, to faces no one else could see. Sometimes he begged, sometimes he accused. Once he screamed so violently that 2 men had to restrain him as he shouted for the key, insisting he had left someone upstairs, that they needed him, that the door must stay locked before it got out. On the 3rd morning, he stopped breathing. The manager insisted on burying him quietly at the edge of the property, far from the family cemetery, with no marker and no prayer. But the workers refused to attend the burial or participate in the digging. In the end, it was the old manager himself, trembling with exhaustion, who lowered the body into the earth with the help of 2 field hands who had been forced into the task only after hours of pleading. One of them later said the ground felt hungry, as if it had been waiting for this. Another said he'd never heard the forest so silent. Both men agreed they had never wanted to see the place again. After the overseer's death, the plantation's routines did not resume. They could not. Something had shifted at the roots of the place. The owner, still absent in whatever distant city he conducted his affairs, sent no word, no inquiry, no acknowledgement of the fire or the revelations that accompanied it. The manager, who had spent most of his tenure averting his gaze from anything unsettling, now seemed hollowed out by what he had witnessed. His authority evaporated. He walked the grounds at odd hours, speaking to no one, tapping his cane rhythmically as if to reassure himself the world was still solid beneath his feet. Most of the workers avoided the house entirely. It was not fear. They had lived with fear for years, but a deeper discomfort, a sense that the house had swallowed something it had no right to hold and might never digest. Some refused to sleep indoors. Others refused to speak of the attic at all. Silence became its own shield, its own strategy of survival. Those who had seen the corpse, the twisted limbs, the remains half merged with the attic boards, gave testimonies to one another in the privacy of the quarters. Their whispered accounts differed slightly, not because they wished to embellish, but because trauma alters memory, rearranging the sequence of horror into something bearable. Some swore the body had moved when the overseer approached it. Others said the eyes had followed them. A few insisted that something else had been up there with the corpse, something that had nothing to do with bones or flesh. The most rational among them dismissed that claim, but even they avoided the attic's burned remains. When the rains came a week later, the charred beams hissed as water soaked into them. For 2 nights, steam rose from the wreck like the ghost of the fire. Children were warned not to play near the house, not because of danger from the structure, but because spirits prefer to be left alone. It was the closest anyone came to naming what they felt. Yet even with the overseer gone, his secret did not disappear. Secrets rarely do. They thicken in the air, cling to the walls, seep into the ground. They wait for new hands to uncover them. Within days, rumors spread to neighboring plantations. A fire, a body, a violent struggle. Some exaggerated the tale until it became almost unrecognizable. Others toned it down, unwilling or unable to believe the truth. In the town, a few spoke of the mad overseer who locked a demon in the attic. Others whispered about a murder cover-up gone wrong. The sheriff rode out once, only to return with a tight jaw and a firm declaration that the matter was handled internally. He filed no report. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the story took on a life of its own. The older workers told it slowly, with long pauses and heavy breaths, as though each repetition cost them something. The younger ones listened in silence, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and recognition. They knew the story was not about ghosts, not truly. It was about a man driven hollow by the weight of his own cruelty. Cruelty he had never needed to confess, because the system around him had enabled it, rewarded it, demanded it. The attic had simply been the final chamber where that cruelty condensed into something too grotesque to conceal. Some wanted the truth recorded. Others wanted it buried forever. The conflict between those two impulses ran quietly beneath the surface of daily life, like an underground stream, steady, unseen, irreversible. A small group approached the manager one afternoon, requesting a formal acknowledgement of what had happened, some document or testimony that would prevent the plantation's owner from twisting the narrative into something benign. But the manager balked. His voice trembled. His breathing hitched. He said he wanted peace, not conflict. He said the fire had been enough. He said the dead overseer could not harm them anymore. So what good would come from dragging the truth into the light? That attic, he whispered, was a mistake from the start. Let it go. They left him there on the porch, staring at the field as if it might offer absolution. In the weeks that followed, an unspoken agreement settled across the plantation. No one used the attic again. No one attempted to rebuild the collapsed section of the house. The owner sent word that labor must resume as usual, but the people who worked the land no longer moved with the quiet, unquestioning obedience the overseer had enforced. The air had changed. Something brittle had snapped inside the power structure, and though the break was subtle, it was undeniable. Still, there were decisions to be made, decisions about memory, about silence, about who would speak and who would not. The man who had first discovered the attic's secret withdrew from the others. He spoke little, worked slowly, and spent evenings sitting alone beneath the magnolia tree, staring at the house without blinking. Sometimes children approached him, asking whether the story was true. He never answered directly. He only said, "Some things once seen can't be unseen. That's the danger of truth." Another worker, a younger woman with a fierce sense of justice, kept a journal hidden beneath her mattress. She wrote down everything she remembered, everything she'd heard, everything she feared. She believed history must have witnesses, even if those witnesses were silenced in their own time. Years later, her notes would resurface in an archive far from Mississippi, their pages brittle but legible, their story chilling in its clarity. Others chose to forget, or tried to, but the land did not forget. The attic's scent of rot, and smoke lingered long after the fire. The spot where the overseer was buried refused to hold grass for 2 seasons. Children claimed to hear faint tapping from the ruins of the roof on stormy nights, a sound like someone searching for a key. The plantation did not collapse immediately, but it faltered. The owner struggled to replace the overseer. Workers began escaping in greater numbers, slipping into the night and vanishing into the marshlands or the distant pine forests. The manager, increasingly frail, could not maintain control. By the time a new overseer was hired, the roots of rebellion had grown deep. And always, beneath every conversation, every silence, every passing glance, lay the memory of that attic. Not just the corpse, not just the crime, but the question it embodied. How far will a man go to hide the truth? Some said the overseer's death was justice. Others said it was simply the final consequence of a chain he had forged himself, link by link, with every choice he had made. But all agreed on one thing. The truth had cost him more than his life. It had devoured him long before the flames finished the job. Weeks later, as the first frost touched the edges of the fields, a traveling preacher stopped at the plantation. He listened to whispers, pieced together the fragments of the story, and asked only one question before leaving. If a secret is buried in darkness for long enough, does it become evil, or does it simply reveal the evil that was already there? He rode away before anyone could answer. Years after the fire, long after the plantation changed hands and the house fell into disrepair, visitors who passed through the area spoke of a strange stillness near the ruins. Some claimed the attic window, though shattered, seemed to watch them. Others said the magnolia tree rustled even when there was no wind. Rumors, folklore, half-truths, they all grew from the same soil. But the written accounts, the testimonies stitched together from surviving voices, tell a simpler, colder story. A man who committed a crime, hid it, protected it, fed it with lies, and ultimately lost everything trying to keep the truth from emerging. A story not of ghosts, but of guilt. A story not of curses, but of consequences. And as any modern storyteller examining the fragments might ask, looking at the fire-blackened beams, the contradictory testimonies, the unanswered questions, was the overseer destroyed by what he hid in the attic, or by the fear of what would happen when the truth finally came out? What do you believe?